Welcome to Liberty Dawning, the podcast of the Worcestershire Branch of the Libertarian Party here in the United Kingdom. This is our inaugural show, and we interview Edward Goodliffe. Mr. Goodliffe is a citizen of Canada who emigrated from the UK in 1975. We discuss his political and philosophical awakening and the journey that led him to G. Edward Griffin's Freedom Force International. Mr. Goodliffe talks about the Canada of today compared with the country he arrived in during the 1970s, as well as a fascinating encounter with former South Rhodesian Premier Ian Smith. We apologise in advance for the sound quality. We hope this doesn't detract too much from your enjoyment. We'll dive straight in. But why I wanted to interview you, Edward, was because you are a self-described staunch individualist, and I'd like you to briefly explain to our audience what you mean by that. Would you describe yourself as a libertarian?
Okay, right. Well, up until a matter of about 4 or 5 years ago, I had no idea that I was an individualist. What I thought was that I was conservative, I suppose you would call it, and then I thought, well, hang on a minute. This doesn't really make sense. All these parties that call themselves conservative, they don't really represent what I like. And then one day I came across some writing from G. Edward Griffin, and he was talking about the spectrum of politics, and he was saying, the popular idea on one which you've got communism, and then on the other end, you've got fascism. And of course, that's always puzzled me, because there's virtually no difference between fascism and communism.
No, indeed.
Totalitarian system. Yeah, so really there's no difference. So how could they be at opposite ends? And of course, that had puzzled me for a very long time. And then when I heard Edward Griffin explaining how political really goes, now that made a whole lot of sense to me. He said there are two types of political system. You have individualism, where you have as little government as possible, and individual rights are as great as possible. Because quite frankly, the more government you have, the less individual that you have.
Sure.
On the other end of the spectrum is the totalitarian total government. And total government would include communism, where everything is directed from the very top and everybody are just peasants. And of course, fascism is the same deal. And in fact, it's very interesting. If you read some of the early National Socialist literature from the 30s,
sure,
you'll see the National Socialists of Germany. They actually stated that the difference between communism and National Socialism was virtually zero. There was no difference. I thought that was quite revealing, because so many people talk about fascism. I mean, corporate fascism is what we really have here in Canada, for example. We have corporate fascism.
Yeah.
Because we have the big corporations and government work closely together, and
indeed so.
They run the show. And not many people would recognise it as corporate fascism, but it is. Anyway, where was the original question?
Well, it was basically, would you describe yourself as a libertarian? Because you describe yourself as an individualist. It seems very much to me that they're exactly the same thing, really. If you believe in minimal or even no government, you are effectively an individualist because you believe in personal liberty and the maximum amount of freedom. Whereas...
That's absolutely right. Maximum amount of freedom to the individual.
Yeah.
You want it to be as close as possible to outright anarchy. You want no government, really. But on the other hand, it's possibly handy to have a bit of government so that you've got a few things organised, like you've got the basic infrastructure, and you can have contract law enforced. And if you've got that, and that's about the size of it, you really leave everything else to the free market, and the free market will sort everything out.
Aptly put. I think I mostly agree with you. I think I have been reading a little bit recently, more anarcho-capitalist kind of literature, and there are so many good ideas about the enforcement of contracts without government. I think no names immediately spring to mind. Oh yeah, I think Maurice Tannehill, I think, was the author of one of the pieces which describe a sort of more a stateless society, effectively, and using insurance systems and contracts to be enforced by third parties, but not necessarily government third parties, just sort of third party arbitrators. And that's something I don't know all that much about at the moment. So I'm on a bit of a voyage of discovery myself at the moment. So anyway, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here. You mentioned the great G. Edward Griffin, and he's.
Yes, and of course, talking about going off at a tangent, James. You were asking me whether I was an individualist and what it was, and of course, it was Griffin that made me realise that I was an individualist. Yeah. And that collectivism is really the root cause of all our problems, because you've got the busybodies trying to micromanage our lives, and we really do not need that. And individualism is the way to go. And unfortunately, throughout the world, it seems to be that everywhere it's collectivism and extreme collectivism in most places. Back to you.
Well, yes, indeed. I think Griffin really nailed it with that, because he really sort of summarised the various strands of socialism, which in my mind include fascism, actually. I think fascism is just another strand of socialism, effectively. I mean, so they were nationalists and socialists. So the clue was in the name, really, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I think Griffin has, in recent years, he's developed a... He conceived of an organisation called Freedom Force International, within which you play quite a central role. Could you describe your position within the organisation, and what are the aims in broad terms?
Right. Well, my position is kind of entertaining, because really what I should do is to tell you how I ended up in position.
Mm-hmm.
And
please do.
What it is, because quite frankly, I'm really not too sure what it is even to this day. But I'm called Speaker of Congress. So I am Speaker of Congress for Freedom Force International, and it sounds very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Came about is really not quite so impressive, really. What happened was, I suppose it must be about 4 or 5 years ago now, I got an email from Edward Griffin. Now, I didn't know him, I just happened to be on his email list because I had bought a few books from Reality Zone, which is his website.
Indeed, yeah.
And so I was on his mail out list. And an email came in and said, "This is the most important email I have ever sent out." Well, when I saw that, I thought, well, I'm going to read the rest of it. So I read it through very carefully and explained how a few years before that date, he and a few others had got together and decided they wanted to improve the lot of the individualists. They wanted to start a movement that represented individualism, and they formed Freedom Force International. Now, I was aware of Freedom Force International. I looked what they had to say, and I agreed with it. But I hadn't really done anything because they didn't seem to be doing anything. So why would I bother to join up? So I didn't even join. But in this letter, he said words that actually described where I'd been. He said because they had done nothing, very few people were actually joining the organisation, and nothing was happening. And they had decided that they were going to launch Freedom Force. And they were going to have the first Congress in California, in a place called Paso Robles. And this was an invitation to go to this first Congress. Well, when I'd finished reading that, I was so inspired. I immediately booked a ticket, some accommodation and a flight and everything, and had it all done within about 4 hours of reading that letter. And I found out later that I was the very first person to enroll. I was the very first person. So I very enthusiastically went off to the first Congress of Freedom Force International. Now, there would have been, I suppose, about 50 people turned up to it. And it was amazing. I mean, I really did enjoy it. It was amazing. It was the first time in my life that I'd actually been in a room full of people where I could talk about virtually any subject and they knew what I was talking about. I mean, I've never experienced that before. I mean, that was a really unique experience. These people knew what was going on, and they knew history, a lot of history, and they knew how things worked. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I've never experienced anything like it. Well, anyway, part of this get-together, Edward Griffin got up and said his piece of where it all started and what his aims were, and it was fascinating. But he then said, well, we need to organise, because we need to actually make this an ongoing effort. This has got to be the start of something great, and we're going to have an annual Congress, and we're going to build this into a worldwide network. And so we had the whole pep talk. Now, at that point, he said, well, I'd like everybody who came to this Congress get up and make a speech and tell us why you came and why you consider yourself an individualist. And so I got up and I said my bit. And so did everybody else. Now, at the end of that, Annalisa Spiegel, who in actual fact was the one who made the whole thing happen, because it was her idea to have this Congress in the first place. It was her that talked Edward Griffin into doing this event. So Annalisa was basically the master of ceremonies, and she said, well, now that everybody's spoken, she said, we need to elect a Speaker of Congress. And she said, the Speaker of Congress is effectively the mouthpiece for us at various events. And we need to elect somebody as Speaker of Congress. So I'd like you to take a ballot form here and vote for one of the people in the room who's spoken. Well, I ended up winning. Oh, I had no idea I was even running for this position.
Okay.
But I ended up getting the job. Now, I think, James, the reason I got the job was because I was in a room full of mostly Americans. And for some reason, if you speak with an English accent, like an Oxford accent, somehow they consider you're an expert. And, for me, talking to you and to an English audience, I'm nothing. But in the United States, they tend to notice. And I think it was just because I spoke with a funny accent that I ended up being Speaker of Congress. So that's how it happened. Was there anything else to that question? How did I become Speaker of Congress?
Well,
what is it? Speaker of Congress. Yeah, well, that I don't really know what it is, other than each time we've had a get-together, each Congress, I have ended up doing quite a bit of the talking, introducing people.
I see. And yeah, in terms of the overall aims and objectives of Freedom Force International, is this going to be more of an educational sort of movement, a kind of I dread to use the phrase, but raising awareness of individualism and a sort of acting as a kind of counterbalance against kind of statism everywhere, or is it going to be more transform into a more sort of political force?
Right. Let me tell you now. The motto of Freedom Force, I can't remember it. It's Latin, of course. I was never that good at Latin, but basically, it's the motto is without power, you cannot defend freedom. That is basically the motto. And so the aim of Freedom Force is to seek power for individualists. Now, there's a major problem with this, and you probably thought of it immediately. Individualists don't like joining. They like to do their own thing. They're off doing their own projects, and they do not want to interfere in everybody else's because they want, frankly, they want to be alone to live their own lives. So individualists tend not to join. That is why we're in the problem we're in, because collectivists tend to be a bunch of busybodies who want to tell everyone else how to live. And so they seek power. They stand for public office, they get into power, and then they dictate to everybody else what they think people should, how people should live. They dictate it to them. Now, individualists don't do this. So with Freedom Force, what we're trying to do is to get the individualists to do something they don't normally do, and that is to join forces together with a bunch of other individualists and get power to get into the power centres of the community, to become councillors, to become union officials, to become members of parliament, members of legislature, whatever the power structures are. We need individualists to get into those power structures to claim back the freedom that we have lost. Yeah. That is the aim of Freedom Force.
Well, that's a very well, indeed, yeah. I mean, that's a great summary of the organisation and exactly what we need, isn't it? Given the fact that politics and everywhere, pretty much throughout the Anglosphere and Western Europe, is dominated by people of a statist, collectivist nature, and with the inherent sort of dangers and hazards that really sort of leads to. When it comes to Canada, you've lived there for, is it like 30 odd years now or something like that?
What is it, about 43 years?
Over 40, yeah, right, okay.
Whatever that is.
Okay.
That's a long time. I've spent most of my life here.
Yeah, because obviously originally you're British, yes. And you moved to Canada. What were your impressions of Canada then, as opposed to Canada now, in terms of sort of governance and the degree to which the national government interfered and interferes now in your life, in your existence?
Oh, the deterioration being very noticeable. The erosion of liberty in Canada it's just incredible, the difference today compared with 1975. I mean, it really was the promised land compared to what it is now. I mean, just to give you an idea, and I was absolutely shocked. This was kind of an unusual thing, but I visited Alberta with Jane, my wife. We weren't married then, but we visited Alberta in 1974. And we were at a place called Pincher Creek, which is kind of rather a nice name, isn't it? Pincher Creek. We were at Pincher Creek, and we were at a barbecue. And at that barbecue, we were chatting with a fellow who was a school teacher, and he was telling us all about how he lived at a place called Beaver Mines. Now, Beaver Mines was an old, I suppose it's like a ghost town. It's a ghost town in the Crow's Nest Pass where they used to have a coal mine. Right. And because the coal mine closed down, the town, and I suppose really it was a village rather than a town, had just gone. And so therefore there were a few houses there, and they were very cheap. This teacher was pleased with his purchase. He had just bought a little house with about an acre of land at Beaver Mines, in just the most beautiful place, because I actually went and had a look at it. And it was just a lovely little place, about 500 square feet, a tiny little place, like a cabin. Yeah. But the price of it, I just about fell off my seat when he told me what he paid. Now, James, just make sure you're seated for this one, because you won't believe this. He bought a freehold property, this little tiny house, for $450. Now, at that time, the pound was $2.70. So how could you possibly buy a freehold property for less than 200 quid. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. Now, at that time in Britain, you could have bought a similar place to that, would have probably cost you £12,000.
In the southeast.
Yeah, in Britain, you probably could have bought one in Sussex for about £12,000, probably at that time. But it was £200. I mean, wow!
Yeah.
I mean, that made me sit up and think. Well, anyway, when we came here, the first house we bought cost us $16,000. So that would have been about £7,000, if that. Well, I mean, that was fantastic. Now that same house today would probably be 150,000.
Right.
And I mean, really, so actually call it 160. So it's gone up by tenfold.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's preposterous. It really is preposterous. And the rules and regulations have gone crazy. The price of energy's gone crazy. Electricity in those days, a quarter. To have electricity in a house for a quarter was, in pound terms, 15 quid. A quarter. Today, you'd expect to pay $250 a month. So that'd be $750 a quarter. So like £300 a quarter now. I mean, that's a huge difference, isn't it?
Well, it's enormous, and it goes to show that there's a had the free market been left to work its magic, you'd still be paying the same price now, probably in real terms, or perhaps even less. But with endless government intervention, that's I would imagine the central cause of the problem, isn't it? Although wholesale prices, worldwide wholesale prices, of course, come into play, but even so.
Government interference has actually driven the prices up. It used to be that the utilities were regulated and they were really cheap. Then they said they were going to privatise them, but really it wasn't sold off to the general public. It was crony capitalism. They basically sold it off to some buddy heads.
Yeah.
And we have been extorted ever since. And that's the story of the tar sands in Alberta. Same deal.
Right.
People like you and me need not apply. It's only multinationals who have bought off the government effectively are the ones who run the show, and then they make a fortune and everybody gets taken to the cleaners, really. Yeah.
That's another one of G. Edwards' topics, isn't it, on many of his podcasts? It's the cartelisation of business across the Western world.
Do not have the capitalism like you would read in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations.
No.
That was free market, no interference. We have corporate fascism where they have interfered to the benefit of the big boys.
Yep.
And they make the rules to keep the competition at bay so that the big boys can clean up. I mean, really, it's far from regular capitalism. And it gets a bad name because it isn't capitalism at all. It's absolute corporate fascism.
Exactly. I mean, in the wake of the financial crisis of 2009, which is probably the moment where I started to think about politics and economics really seriously for the first time, rather late in life, but there we go. The whole chaotic episode has been blamed on capitalism. Whereas it's got nothing to do with capitalism, true capitalism, really. It's all there's no such thing as laissez-faire, and hasn't been for decades. Probably since before the First World War, actually, in economic terms. You're looking at endless government interventions through regulation or the cartelisation of the private sector, with the natural consequences that. That we saw with the too big to fail episodes with the financial institutions, and really too big to fail is too big to exist. I'm sure you'd agree. Why has it developed into an atmosphere that's hostile to capitalism?
Right. Okay. I think I know where you're coming from now. was I could get quite excited about this, because you've got socialism coming at us wherever you look. Wherever you look, there's this idea that it's cool to be socialist. It's such a wonderful system, and we're going to look after everybody. Everybody's going to be looked. They have wrecked the countries. They have wrecked the whole living standard. And wherever they own the money system, who want a one world government run by them, where they are absolute dictators and everybody are peasants. And what is the best way to achieve this? It is none other than socialism. And so therefore, they are going to promote that. Now, I didn't realise this, James, that I didn't actually switch on to this until one day when I read Ian Smith's book, The Great Betrayal, all about how southern Rhodesia was sold out. It was a fascinating book, and I had rather admired Ian Smith because he had the guts to tell Britain to get stuffed and declare independence. And I remember that very clearly, and he was being vilified in the press. Everyone was saying Ian Smith was a terrible bloke.
Sure.
But I kind of admired him. I thought, there's a man who is standing up for his people. He really is looking after the people of southern Rhodesia, and I admired him. So anyway, I read his book, and in that book it had, he actually made that in that absolutely floored me. I mean, it went against everything I believed to be true. He said that Britain and the US were the promoters of communism. I thought, wow, that can't be. I mean, I thought the US and Britain were constantly fighting against communism. How could they possibly be the promoters of communism? Well, anyway, it bothered me. It bothered me mightily. And it just so happened that with this Australian gold prospector, and one thing led to another. And at one point he said to me, I'm going prospecting for gold in Zimbabwe. I thought, Zimbabwe? Oh, that's the old Rhodesia. He said, do you want to come along? And I said, oh, yes, Bruce, I'll come with you. So anyway, I went with Bruce, and we went gold prospecting in Zimbabwe. It was incredible. Going there. And on the second trip, I thought, you know what, I'm going to take this opportunity to find Ian Smith. And so what I did is I asked every white person I came across, and there aren't many white people there. Whenever I saw a white person in the street, I'd go up to her and say, hey, tell me, do you know where Ian Smith lives? And nobody seemed to know for quite a while. But after asking that 20-odd people, the fellow said, oh, yes, he's got a farm, where it was, there or wherever it was. But anyway, he said it's also got a house in Harare, which is the old Salisbury.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh, right, I'm going to see if I can find that. So I kept asking more. I want to go and find Ian Smith. And he said, oh, yeah, I'll take you there right away. And I said, you know where he lives? And he said, no. And he said, I thought you knew. And I said, no, I don't know where he lives. So why don't we go to a good area of the town and ask? And so we did. We went to a good area and kept asking people where Ian Smith lived. And, you know, this is going to end up being an expensive taxi ride. But anyway, it was pretty reasonable. This fellow was pretty reasonable. And I went from one place to another. And then came in, this fellow said, yeah, he's on Phillips Avenue. So we drove to Phillips Avenue and kept asking then. And I came across this place where there was a security man outside this really nice house. So I said to him, excuse me, do you know where Ian Smith lives? And he said, yes, he's number 33 down by the Cuban embassy. Ah, thank you very much. So we drove down to 33 Phillips Avenue, and it was a typical English house with beautiful flowers in the garden. And this side, one side was embassy, and the other side was some barricaded up place. But Ian Smith's house, there was no fence, just a hedge and a garden gate. And I just walked down the garden path, banged on the door, and to my amazement, Ian Smith answered the door. So I asked him, I said to him, Mr. Smith, I've come a long way, and I've booked The Great Betrayal, and there's one or two things I really wanted to ask you about the book. And he said, oh yeah, come on in. So I paid up the taxi driver. For the next hour or so, I sat in Ian Smith's living room and we talked about this. And he gave me a massive education.
Right.
All about how, since the days of Cecil Rhodes, there's been this drive for a one world government, and how Britain and West did communism in Russia, and they started communism in China, and they have promoted communism in the United Nations, and they basically are the ones backing the communist movement. And whoa, that was just the most incredible thing for me to listen to. So I went home and I started researching it, and I came across Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. You see there how it was Wall Street money that bankrolled the Russian Revolution. In fact, the revolutions were New York Jews. Bronstein was Trotsky, and a whole bunch of them. They all changed their names to Russian names, and they were all out of New York. I mean, it's just amazing. And this is not the sort of stuff you get taught in school. This is the sort of that is hid from the general public.
Indeed so.
So, at the end of the day, the United Nations is a tool for one world government, and they are communist to the core. Forget democracy and freedom for individuals. We're heading for one world totalitarian communism, and it's going to be an absolute hellhole. We need to stop that happening.
Yeah,
I'll let you speak now.
That is, it's an amazing story. I hadn't known you'd met Ian Smith. I did meet someone in recent years when I was a member of UKIP, who was also a member, and he was somebody who'd fought in the Rhodesian Bush War in the late 70s. He's now, in his opinion, the Ian Smith period in southern Rhodesia was when the country was at its best.
I'd say when I was there, I met mostly black people is what I met, mostly black people, and I didn't come across any of them that actually disliked Ian Smith, and most of them had a great deal of respect for him, and I was quite surprised at that. And please see it.
And you'd never know that if you followed a mainstream media narrative about the guy, because he was utterly demonised in the Western press. And yet he was popular with very ordinary people, including a good portion of the black population in Zimbabwe. It's quite staggering.
Absolutely.
I was very interested. You mentioned Anthony C. Sutton, because I know some of his work is kind of restated in G. Edward Griffin's. But I went to a history sort of festival in Gloucester last year. And one of the, because it was the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, or the two Russian revolutions, and one of the authors there had written a book about the year 1917 in Russia. I asked him how the Bolshevik Revolution was financed, and he didn't know. Now I knew because I'd watched lots of interviews with Anthony Sutton on YouTube, and realised that. Trotsky at one point was stopped in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with $20,000 in gold on him, and then subsequently put back on the boat and allowed to proceed on his journey onward to St. Petersburg. So
yes, in fact, he was arrested by the RCMP, and then there were orders from London to release him.
Yeah. And it's kind of staggering, but
so you know whose side they were on in London, don't you? Full communism established in Russia, and the Russians didn't want it. In fact, they had a great difficulty getting it established because, as you say, there were two revolutions. Yes.
Yeah, the first revolution was the genuine grassroots revolution, and that could have gone any sort of way, but the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't a revolution. In fact, it was, just a coup d'état, which which triggered the Civil War, of course. And it wasn't until I listened to Anthony Sutton on one of his interviews that I realised that a large amount of Bolsheviks actually joined in the revolution against Lenin and his cabal, and they were called the Greens. And because they realised that Lenin had sold out the revolution as far as they were concerned. So it was these Bolsheviks, green Bolsheviks, fighting alongside the whites, fighting alongside the foreign troops like the British and whoever else who sent some troops there. So it was it's part of the historical narrative that seems to have been lost to a large degree, I think, in the modern kind of media portrayals.
Absolutely, and people have no idea. And I mean, if you fast forward to the Second World War, and you realise that the Russians under Stalin were going to overrun Europe, because we were told that narrative of how Hitler was so aggressive and he was attacking everybody, but he was small potatoes compared to what Stalin was doing, invading Finland and invading Poland and Lithuania and Latvia. He just took over the Balkan countries, didn't he?
Indeed so, yeah.
And yet, we get told we only hear Hitler was the aggressor. When you see that Stalin was about to attack, and that's why the Germans had such success in those early days of that Operation Barbarossa, was because the Soviets were amassed ready to attack, and so they weren't expecting to be attacked themselves. And again, we don't hold that part of history, do we? In fact, that's how you and I is for research. Very effective.
Indeed so. Well, without going into too many details on that, it was yes. I mean, the premeditation of the Operation Barbarossa. Sorry, the preemptive attack, shall we say, rather, was
yes.
It is borne out in some only in some studies of the Second World War. It really is not something again that's well known.
But yeah, and something which people need to know and yet don't. It's in Major Jordan's diaries. I don't know whether you ever came across that, but Major Jordan's diaries, when I first heard about it, I sought out a second-hand copy because it's been out of print for years, but I got a copy of that book, and in that book it documents how the Americans gave the atomic bomb to the Russians, how they gave it to them. Canada supplied the uranium and gave the entire Manhattan Project. Most people don't realise this, but it's documented in Major Jordan's diaries. He's got the bills of lading where you see the components needed for making the atomic bomb, how they were being shipped in the Lend-Lease program to the Russians. And everyone's saying, it was a surprise that they exploded an atomic bomb. No, it wasn't. Roosevelt went out of his way to give it to them.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting piece of history. That I don't know that particular story, but I'll check out those diaries.
It's an amazing
what
story.
I did know again was again from Anthony Sutton's work was that there were a hell of a lot of corporate giants in North America who and Western Europe who invested in the Soviet Union. They invested. They developed factories. I mean, Henry Ford developed a factory just outside Moscow during the 1920s.
Yes.
And they remained. I mean, they didn't badge it Ford. Obviously, they badged it with a Soviet sort of name. But American fighter pilots flying over Vietnam over North Vietnam reported seeing Ford trucks being used by the North Vietnamese.
They were manufacturing the weapons of war to kill their own people. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. It's bizarre, totally bizarre.
Crazy world we live in. Nothing is as it appears, and just about everything is the inversion of what you think it is.
And the vast majority of people, I suspect, listening to this podcast would probably be laughing at how far out we are, and what a pair of weirdos we probably sound.
case, because what I'm saying is outrageous. It is outrageous, but I've lived long enough now that I've had the time to do the research and to meet people and see these things, and it's changed my opinions on so many things. I mean, the way I look at the world today compared to 40 years ago is an incredible transition. In fact, going right back to being a child, I mean, I can remember being maybe 12 years old, listening to my father talking with my grandfather, who fought in the Boer War.
Right.
And the two of them were chatting about political events of that day. And I was listening to them and thinking, how could they be so cynical? How could they be so cynical? Well, now that I've got to that age, I realise full well how you could be that cynical, because that is the way things are. That is the way things are. In fact, I think of my grandfather. I'd love to be able to have a chat with him, because the research I've done on the Boer War, I have a feeling that my grandfather probably felt he was fighting on the wrong side.
Yeah.
Because he was a farmer, and when he went out there and he was fighting the Boers, who were the farmers out there, and Britain was basically stealing their land so that they could get the gold and diamonds of the country. So, I mean, really, it was a very unjust war, and he was fighting on the wrong side.
Yeah. And, of course...
It's terrible to be fighting for your country, and you find out that your country is just raping and pillaging, basically,
and
not doing the honourable thing.
And also introducing the concept of concentration camps as well to the world for the first time.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's horrific. I mean, you know, I born in Britain, and by an accident of birth, you know, we're British, and there's lots of good things about Britain, but wow, there's a lot of things that are pretty shameful in the history when you look at it.
Oh yeah.
And things you can't say, you know, that was right. It wasn't right to be in there stealing that from Boers. And the poor old Boers are going to have it again now, because you see in South Africa, I don't know whether you've been watching what's going on in South Africa.
Absolutely.
The new president there, he's said they're going to steal the land from the white farmers.
He's taken his cue from Mr. Mugabe, basically, and including right down to the printing trillions of new money. Utter madness.
Yes, they're going to trash their money. They're going to cut off their food supply, because the food supply will collapse when they destroy those farms. It's just going to be a repeat of Zimbabwe. And how could they be that stupid? And I suppose the answer is very easily. Yeah.
Indeed so. And again, it's just totally ironic, isn't it, that these two countries of such great natural resources, I mean, Zimbabwe used to be named the breadbasket of Africa, and you know, South Africa, with all its mineral-rich kind of deposits, you know, they're heading for total economic. Zimbabwe also has reached economic basket case status years ago, but South Africa, even more sadly, has gone down the same route, as well as participating in genocide, of course, against the white farmers. I noticed Lauren Southern did a piece just recently on the Boer farmers. Lauren Southern, of course, who has been banned from the UK for yeah.
You've got to admire her. She's doing a great job.
Oh yeah, and she's so young, and she's so bright and inquisitive, and all she is asking questions.
Yeah, and her heart's in the right place. And the fact is that there is a genocide building there, and it's going to happen unless somebody does something about it. And the Western world just doesn't seem to give a damn.
No, indeed. So moving on to the last part of our chat, Edward, because I'll let you go on the hour. This issue of free speech and censorship. To what degree have you seen that also be eroded in Canada, you know, during your time in the country?
Well, the answer to that is most definitely affirmative. We no longer have free speech in Canada. I mean, either you've got free speech or you haven't got free speech, and we no longer have free speech because there are certain subjects we are no longer allowed to speak about without going to jail, which is a great shame. It's a great shame because without speech, freedom is going. I mean, it is going because you cannot alert the general public to an injustice if that particular protected segment of the society is the perpetrator. So if I'm not allowed to speak about a certain group of people and that certain group of people is hiring to carry out the most horrific event, how can I alert people? I can't, because there's no freedom of speech. So that's where we are. It's gone. In Canada, it's gone. There are subjects here I am not allowed to talk about without being thrown in jail. And we see, because of that, your David Icke is not allowed to come to Canada.
Oh, I see. He's joined David Irving in being banned then.
Yes, yeah, he has been banned. Yeah, he is not allowed here. Now, David Icke, I am not aware that he has harmed anyone ever.
Nope.
I mean, he is no harm to anybody, but they are terrified of him because he speaks the truth and wakes people up. And he might have some strange opinions, but you know, in the case of David Icke, I've had lots of people know and said, "No, listen, he's a total waste." But no, you can't afford to do that. You've got to listen to anybody that is telling you something different and listen to it carefully. Now, you can write him off as a nutcase, but you shouldn't write any off as a nutcase. You should listen to what they say and look for evidence.
Well, quite right. Yeah,
anyway.
Absolutely.
So anyway, erosion of freedom of speech, yes, most definitely. It's getting all the time. The political correctness is a way of trying to get everybody to censor what they say. And we need to rebel against this. Everyone needs massive non-compliance with all this stuff. That's the only way to go. Oh
yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that the big corporations are obviously well involved in this kind of censorship, aren't they? As well, Google, your Facebooks, little independent outfits like World Alternative Media in Canada being demonetized on YouTube, etc. You get Tommy Robinson here in the UK being banned from Twitter without actually having said anything of any import.
Yes, talk about that World Alternative Media in Canada from Winnipeg. That's John Snyson.
Yeah,
and he's on the Leadership Council of Freedom Force.
Oh, is he? Oh, right. Well, I shouldn't be surprised, I suppose.
yeah, he's a good bloke, and that and his buddy Snyson, Josh Sigurdsson. That's his buddy. He came to the Red Pill Expo last year in Bozeman, Montana. He is a real live wire. Josh Sigurdsson, a fascinating fellow.
Yeah, he seems to be hyperactive and certainly very driven.
That's what you need to be.
Yeah. Well, now you touch on the Red Pill Expo. I thought we might close out this interview by you giving maybe a quick summary of what it's all about and what the objectives are and where you're meeting this year.
Right. Okay. Well, with Freedom Force International, part of the program when we had that first Congress, the idea came up to call it the Red Pill University.
Yeah.
Where you would learn all these things to open your mind, which seemed to be a very good idea. So by extension from that, we came up with the idea that rather than just continuing to have annual congresses where we all get together with Freedom Force, we would instead do Red Exposition, where we would bring to the forefront of people's imagination the truth of what's really going on. So they take the red pill. And the first one was held in Bozeman, Montana last June. And it was an overwhelming success. There were more than 600 people turned up. It was expensive to go to, so it's amazing that people went to the expense of buying the tickets and flying there to a remote location effectively and experiencing it. It was like that first Freedom Force Congress, but on steroids. Huge. And the atmosphere at Bozeman was simply incredible. It was absolutely wonderful. In fact, I spoke twice at the event, and on one of those occasions, I think it was the one where I was talking about Freedom Forces. It was my job to tell people what Freedom Force was all about. And when I got up into the crowd and made a statement, when I think back on it, I realized that I could not have said that anywhere else and got the reaction I got, because I was talking about political systems, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, let's face it, democracy stinks.
Yeah.
And people rose up and cheered. Everyone was cheering. Where else on earth could I get up and say that democracy stinks and people cheer?
Yeah.
Because most people would think, oh, that's absolutely horrifying that you say democracy stinks, because that's the best form of government. It's so perfect. But it isn't perfect. It's mob rule.
Yep.
And raw democracy is mob rule, and mob rule does stink. And unless you have some very, very substantial checks and balances, it's a horrible system of government.
Indeed.
It seems like the cat wanted to make a statement here. See, the cat has come to help me.
Aha! Yes.
Anyway, now,
So, where are you meeting this year? Is it Washington?
In Spokane, Washington, June 21st, 22nd and 23rd. And in fact, today is the last day for the ultra cheap tickets. And there's a discount today up until midnight, and then the price goes up a little bit, and then it goes up again as we get closer to the event. I understand a lot of tickets have been sold, because I know when I went to book a hotel room a back ago, I was having trouble finding. So I think it's going quite well. It should be really good. We've got some good people coming. In fact, one of the fellows who's coming, a young man by the name of Jim Lee. Jim is most knowledgeable, fascinating young man. But anyway, there's loads of good people. Lord Christopher Monckton's going to be there. Edward Griffin's going to be speaking. There's Kiyosaki, the fellow that wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Yeah, there's a whole collection of people that are going to be really, really interesting.
Okay, well, that sounds like a cracking event. Is there a website that people can go to?
Yes, there's a website. They can go to the redpillexpo.org.
Okie dokie. Well, Edward Goodliffe, thank you for your time today. And we'll leave it there for the moment, and I hope you'll come back on our show in the future.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you for calling me up.
Well, thank you for listening to our inaugural broadcast. Please join us again next time. If you're interested in learning anything about the Libertarian Party in the UK, please go to our website libertarianparty.co.uk.